Sometimes it's the road less traveled. Other times it's important to be in the right place at the right time. It's called serendipity, and when it's combined with integrity, it can lead a person on a journey to the most unimaginable places. It's safe to say that as Sojiro Kitagawa, the founder of Kitagawa Company Limited, held all three attributes back in 1905 when he opened a simple fish market that flourished into a landmark Big Island business. Over the years, it has grown to include Kama'aina Motors, Kona Auto Center, and Napa Parts Center, Hawaii.
Having a business 100 years old, you don't think about it, but because it's like a business any place else. I mean, you just come to work, you do the things that you have to do, and then you go home. But it feels like a tradition and a heritage that, I'm trying to carry on. You can't do the same things your father did or your grandfather did. You have to do new things, different ways to keep it growing.
The face of transportation was about to progress from the era of horse-drawn carriages to the age of horseless carriages. But to understand exactly how this came about, we have to go back even a few years before 1900. Various machines were built to propel vehicles by steam in the 1800s. Trains, ships, and by the mid-1850s, huge fire engines, most of which ran on coal fired to heat boilers. From the 1860s on, steam-driven cars and trucks were developed, but few achieved more than fleeting local fame. These vehicles were novelties at best, odd curiosities with little practical purpose. But while steamships and railroads brought the world closer together, local communities remained as isolated as ever. And even by the late 19th century, the horse was still the most common form of transportation both on the mainland and Hawaii. Hilo, Hawaii, in the late 19th century was an idyllic agrarian community where the sugar industry reigned king, successfully developed by Scottish and English businessmen in the last 2 decades of the century. Around the small city then was mostly open pasture, native fish ponds supplying abundant fish for the local inhabitants, scattered houses, and several churches. A handful of dirt roads crisscrossed Hilo town. But outside the city there were none, only narrow and treacherous bridle paths. Grass homes were common in the countryside. As late as 1885, travel was by foot or horseback. There were only 3 horse-drawn carriages in town. But that was all about to change. No one man invented the motor car, but it's true to say that the 1880s saw the crystallization of ideas that had been incubating for some time into a mechanical reality. Built in 1891, the Lambert may have been the first gasoline-powered American car, although several others have laid claim to the title. The Duryea, the Black, Henry Neydig's car, and the Schlemmer wagon, they all appeared in the early 1890s. Steam cars were also progressing, their technologies getting more efficient, safer, and more reliable. Additionally, several electric cars quietly rolled onto the scene. Initially, electric cars were popular, but they were slow and had limited range, and were really only well suited for a turn in the park. Steam cars were considered smoother and more practical than the internal combustion engine, despite the time it took to heat up and the tendency for the boiler to explode. In fact, as late as 1896, cars were so rare in the U.S. that the Barnum and Bailey Circus displayed a Duryea as its main attraction, with top billing over the giant, the fat lady, and the elephant. Most early American cars were spindly, spidery affairs with carriage wheels and cart springs. High wheels were necessary to negotiate the rutted country roads, and many builders were wagon manufacturers who found it difficult to separate the idea of the horseless carriage from the horse and carriage. Car makers multiplied like rabbits, and by the end of the century there were 45 registered automobile manufacturers, 75 by 1920, most of whom were gone by 1930. Sugar was most definitely the life of Windward, Hawaii in the first half of the 1900s. The Big Island produced an appreciable part of the sugar consumed on the mainland U.S., a steady supply of labor maintained by immigration and all-year employment in the sugarcane fields. Like many Japanese, Isojiro Kitagawa arrived in Hawaii in 1903 and began working in the sugar fields near Honolulu, about 15 miles outside of Hilo. But a life of servitude was not to be Isojiro's destiny.
My great-grandfather came over, he paid his own way, and he came over to cut cane, and he came from Hiroshima, where most of the people in Hilo came from. They didn't come from Tokyo, they came from the outlying areas. So he came over here and he was supposed to cut cane, and the story is he cut cane for half a day. I guess he didn't like working out in that dirt.
Isojiro returned to Japan to serve his country in the Russo-Japanese War in Manchuria. When he came back to the island in 1905, he was filled with ambition and a sharp business mind.
The main industry at that time, or one of the major industries in Hilo, other than sugarcane, was fishing industry. There was a lot of sampans in Hilo Bay, and he decided to go back to what I guess his family knew, and so he became a fish peddler.
It was here on the shores of Hilo Bay that Isojiro made a commitment to care about people. Although he spoke no English, he was an amiable man, well liked by all those living in Hilo town. The enterprising Kitagawa began to supply fishermen with groceries, fishing supplies, and other items. It was during these early years that he and a number of Japanese fishermen founded Suisan, which is still a thriving business in Hilo today. Hilo resident Lewis T. Grant first proposed importing horseless carriages to the territory of Hawaii. Grant had been superintendent of the Hilo Electric Light Company and had installed the first electric light system in the city of Hilo in 1895. At that time, in order to establish enough business, Helco furnished free installation and free light bulbs for a trial period to see if people liked the new device. Ironically, Grant left for Honolulu, where he imported several electric cars from the mainland. Residents of the Big Island who traveled to Oahu saw the new vehicles and wanted one. But muddy roads and a lack of available electricity meant battery-powered cars were not really practical on the Big Island. Gasoline-powered autos appeared, both steam and internal combustion, and these vehicles seemed far more suitable for the back roads of Hawaii Island. By 1905, there were approximately 8,000 cars in the United States. The Big Island had less than a dozen. There were only 144 miles of paved roads on the mainland U.S. Hawaii Island had no paved roads at all. In 1901, the first passenger car arrived on the island, a locomobile steamer. Its performance proved the viability of gas-powered vehicles. But within 3 months of its arrival, the new vehicle also had the distinction of being involved in the island's first automobile accident, when the driver got out to open a gate and the car rolled into a fence. In 1905, a parade was held in downtown Hilo. All the cars in Hilo participated, all 6 of them. In the early days of the automobile in Hawaii, it was common to see parade cars decked out with flowers. So many, in fact, you could hardly see the cars. Meanwhile, with a watchful eye to the changes happening around him, Kitagawa expanded his business again, this time to include a new product called petroleum gasoline in 1908, selling fuel and lubricating products as well as fishing supplies. Soon he had a contract with Standard Oil, cornering the market to become the largest distributor of petroleum on the Big Island.
The wharf here, there wasn't really a wharf you could bring a ship into. So they used to roll the 55-gallon drums off the barges and let them float into shore. That's how they used to get the gas.
Isojiro helped the sampan owners convert their wind and man-powered flat boats into faster vehicles with gas-powered motors. Naturally, engine parts, repair service, and gas products were needed to keep up with the changing times, and Kitagawa's business continued to grow. Hilo's booming sugar industry, coupled with the new train service up the Hamakua coast and into Puna, brought more workers to Hilo. But unlike the railway whose tracks were laid out before it, the infrastructure of the automobile was at best inadequate, and in Hawaii's case, non-existent. But Hilo's burgeoning economy meant small businesses like Kitagawa's had enough support from the local population to grow. By 1913, Isojiro added a service station to his growing enterprise. It was located between the Hilo Ironworks and Suisan. Soon he began to sell automobile parts and tires, and so his business increased to the point where he needed additional help. He hired young Masaichi Nakamura to do deliveries, while the boy was still finishing up his education at Hilo High. Nakamura recalls filling automobile gas tanks from 5-gallon pails. He soon became Kitagawa's right-hand man, serving as his interpreter, since Isojiro never spoke nor wrote English. In 1915, Isojiro purchased a shipment of cars to sell. He received 3 Argos, 1 Metz, and 1 Crow Elkhart. At the same time, Isojiro also began selling Diamond T trucks, a slow-moving stake truck with solid tires. In 1918, Kitagawa hired a full-time serviceman. Ryuzo Moriguchi was put in charge of the service station and the parts department. The firm now numbered a dozen regular employees. The next year, the service station was expanded, and building supplies and hardware were added to the growing enterprise. But by 1922, Isojiro relinquished the building supply portion of the business to a group of men who founded the Hawaii Planing Mill Limited, HPM, the firm that is still one of Hilo's leading businesses. The 1920s were years of great success for Kitagawa and Hilo in general. Hilo's population had exploded in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, jumping from 20,000 in 1900 to 34,000 in 1930. Now lumber and pineapple added to the revenues of the train and King Sugar, and cars were all the rage. Kitagawa Company was off and running. Hilo was now serviced by inter-island steamers twice a week and had regular service from San Francisco, and bi-weekly New York routes were established, all before the Panama Canal was built. Early on, cars were floated in from boats between sampans. Later, they were offloaded on pallets slung by ropes. Naturally, ships arriving were of great interest to the local population, and the docks were regularly crowded with families and friends, and of course, laymakers. During the 20s, having achieved a measure of success selling cars, Isojiro went into the business on a larger scale. In 1923, he added Durant, Star, and Flint automobiles to his warehouse, and before long, as amazing as it seems, the Kitagawa Company was selling more automobiles per capita than any other car dealer west of the Rocky Mountains. Metz, Durant, Maxwell Briscoe, Brush, Rio, Columbia, and Corbin. Those were just a few of some 75 car manufacturers that sprang up in the early part of the century. Many came and went in just a few years. And interestingly, many of the early cars looked almost exactly the same. Often it was only the emblem on the radiator that distinguished one from another. Road trips were common for residents and visitors alike, up the Hamakua coast, and of course, to the fire pits of Kilauea Volcano in the national park. In spite of the 1929 stock market crash, Hilo's economy stayed strong, and Kitagawa took full advantage. In the 30s, the business added DeVoe, Continental, Rockney, and Studebaker. All but Studebaker went under quickly. Natural disasters struck I. Kitagawa and Company 3 times, but each time, through determination and hard work, the company managed to retrench, relocate, and begin again. A small tsunami in 1923 foretold devastating events to come to Hilo. It destroyed several sampans in the bay and caused serious flooding of Kitagawa's auto warehouse, but had no lasting effects on the business. The garage and most of its contents survived this first brush with nature's fury, but it would hardly be the last. In 1941, I. Kitagawa was incorporated, and ground was broken on a new location at Kamehameha and Pio Pio Street, near where Bayfront Chevron is located today. Soon, Kitagawa obtained the Chrysler Plymouth and International Truck franchises. The business did well through the 30s, but when the U.S. entered World War II, there were no longer any cars left to sell. To stay alive, the entrepreneur also began diversifying his products, offering a complete line of general electric appliances. Washers, dryers, refrigerators, and even television sets and lawnmowers were added to the inventory. The business also provided Willard batteries, BF Goodrich tires, and automobile service. In the early hours of April 1, 1946, an Alaskan earthquake generated a series of gigantic waves. 2,300 miles away in Hawaii, damage from the ensuing tsunami was unbelievable. Hardest hit was Hilo Bayfront and what is now Wailoa State Park. 159 people in Hawaii lost their lives that day, 96 in Hilo and 24 in nearby Lapahoehoe. Back in 1932, Kitagawa had bought the Volcano Garage building on Kamehameha Avenue for investment purposes. The building had originally housed the Volcano stables, a transportation and draying business, and was once a Hilo landmark. The tsunami of 1946 completely destroyed the original dealership and damaged the new Pio Pio Street location. Isajiro's son-in-law, Tsutai Kitagawa, was working in the original location when the first wave struck.
My grandfather was in the building at that time, and he said he got washed around inside the building in the first wave, and so he got out after the first wave.
The I. Kitagawa Company temporarily relocated at the Volcano Garage during the rebuilding of the Pio Pio property. During that time, the business survived solely on its parts and tire business. When the facility was rebuilt, Tsutai Kitagawa took over as president of the business. He was a no-nonsense businessman, but the man they called simply Governor is remembered fondly.
Governor was an impressive man. He came to work every day with a three-piece suit.
Mr. Kitagawa Tsutai, he treated me so good. And since I worked so long, they even tell me, "Oh, you're part of the family, yeah?"
The business at Pio Pio steadily grew, but 14 years later, history repeated itself as the 1960 tsunami completely destroyed the downtown Hilo location.
There were a lot of tsunami warnings at that time, or they weren't called tsunamis at that time, they used to call them tidal waves. And their usual thing was they would take the paperwork and documents and put it on the second floor, and then move the cars up the street. Well, as I understand, there were so many of these warnings, they got tired of moving the papers, the documents, and moving the cars. So I guess they didn't move it far enough because somebody went out to get a jacket out of the car across the street, and they saw a wall of water over the breakwater. And he ran into the building and told everybody that the tidal wave was coming, and they all sprinted out of there. One or two of them climbed a coconut tree, a couple of them ran up the street. My father and another person, because he couldn't get to his car, they jumped in a Volkswagen Bug and drove off, and everybody got away. Nobody was hurt from that, but that was the real one, and that's when the facility was knocked off. It was actually knocked off its foundation. Everything was destroyed, basically because it's salt water. Everything was, I mean, they took what cars they could, and they salvaged them, and they sold them off as salvage. In fact, the wave was so powerful, it took the safes through the building and into the river and behind. They were taken through walls now. It went to the walls of the building and then into the river. At least 50 to 100 yards. They're huge. They gotta be a couple of tons each.
Yeah, it's a big safe, you know. It's really big. And then they salvaged everything that was inside the safe. But you know, they had to dry it out, and we still have some of those things, you know.
Some of the older documents are still watermarked because they sat in the river until they pulled the safe out of there. The safe was full of water. And these safes, we still have them. They don't work very well, we still have them.
Looking at all the damage and whatnot, we know that we cannot salvage anymore. So Mr. Kitagawa said to Iwao if we should start all over again, because that was a big thing, you know, to start all over again.
And I remember seeing my father the next day. He looked like he had seen a ghost, or he was white as a sheet. I mean, he was just looked like he was in shock, because it basically destroyed the business. I mean, this is a business he was working in since he came back from college.
I'm quite sure, because we didn't spend too much money, they had enough to restart their business. We worked at Mr. Tsutai Kitagawa's house until everything was done. And then we went to fire station. There was a big warehouse in the back. It was old and was dirty. The most of the things that we lost was the parts. All the parts and the office and everything else, and everything was gone. So we had to restock everything. So my husband and I, we had to go and build up the new inventory and put them all on the cards before they had the computers and whatnot. But that was plenty of work.
Some members of the family wanted to call it quits after the devastating tidal wave. But Isojiro Kitagawa's grandson, Iwao Kitagawa, was determined that the business would survive.
The family wanted to give up. I mean, they had 2 tidal waves, 2 disasters, and he was still a young man yet, and he told me that he wanted to go on.
My grandparents were already older, and they really didn't want to restart the business. And of course, my great-grandfather was gone. So they would support my father and back him if he wanted to restart the business after the tsunami. There was a lot of question whether, how they would do it, where would they move to. Businesses at that time were all centered around downtown Hilo. This site where we're located now was in the boondocks, okay? It was in no place. The road was a 2-lane road. It looked like something you'd find as a side street. Plus, they started out as negative capitalization, $200,000. And that's when $200,000 was $200,000. So they started really in a deep hole. So, but with my grandparents backing, with my father's energy, they had an SBA loan, which my father tried to pay off as fast as he could because he hated working with the government. They restarted the building.
Thanks to the grants and the conservation of the company, ground was broken on the new facility at 400 Kavili Street in 1960. The new modern facility, with over 50,000 square feet of floor space, including a showroom and service center, opened in the fall of 1961. By that time, the Kitagawa Company had nearly 50 employees, but the expansion of this durable business wasn't done yet. more exclusive franchises were added to the company, including Chrysler, Plymouth, Dodge, Datsun, Nissan, and Lancer. Kitagawa and Company opened West Hawaii's showrooms in Kailua Kona and Captain Cook. Napa Auto Parts was added to the company in 1955 and was originally a part of Kitagawa's Pio Street facility. The first Parts Center Hawaii store was located at 400 Kavili Street. Subsequently, the franchise expanded to Captain Cook, Kailua Kona, and Waimea. In late 2005, the Hilo store was relocated to 1284 Kilauea Avenue. After the move to the new facility, Iwao Kitagawa took over the reins, but Governor still made his presence felt.
He would enter the company through the back of the service department. He would walk through the center of the service department, greet everybody, good morning young man, how was your day, and walk right through the service department, on down the hallway into the front showroom and greet just about every employee before he enters his office. Very nice man. Iwao Kitagawa, good businessman. He was a party guy after work, you know. Played hard, but worked hard. Everything with Mr. Kitagawa was first class for his workers. Everything that he had prepared for you, or if he takes you on a trip, everything was taken care of first class. And he expected that type of work too, though, you know, giving the best. And we always did.
If Kitagawa's expansion seems inevitable, the movement of the businesses seems inherent. The Datsun-Nissan franchise is a case in point. The Datsun franchise was added in 1966 and located next to the 400 Kavili Street facility. Soon it was moved to 471 Kalaniana Ole. Shortly thereafterwards, it became Big Island Nissan, and then, in 1992, it was moved back to the site of the old Kitagawa gas station on Kavili Street. Other lines of transportation came and went over the years and included Honda motorcycles, Volkswagen, Subaru, and Hyundai. But Kitagawa's business as the century wound down wasn't always easy.
The challenges of when sugar plantations went down in the 90s, the troubles with Chrysler when it almost went bankrupt in the 80s. So it's been, you know, it's hard keeping a business going because it's just not, there's a lot of external factors that have to do with the business that you have no control over.
Chrysler's near bankruptcy in the 1980s almost took Kitagawa with it. Iwao called this the economic tsunami of the 80s. But Chrysler was bailed out just in time, and Kitagawa was able to right the ship. Current president, Brian Kitagawa, is Iwao's son, is Sojiro's great-grandson. Like his great-grandfather, Brian's start in the business was also humble.
I got into the business washing cars. It seemed like where you came into this business is you had to wash cars. And you washed them by the hundreds. But, I mean, nothing gets it. I mean, I did that for a number of years, you know. I prep cars, not very well, count parts, clean cars, you know, any job that anybody else didn't want to do, we'd do. Because they're coming in the night before, you know.
Brian understands the pioneering spirit and heritage of the men who built the company before him and is determined to keep adapting the business. He took over in the 1980s, adding the Jeep Eagle vehicle lines into the fold in the early 1990s. He also consolidated the two West Hawaii showrooms in Kailua, renaming it Kona Auto Center.
Our Kona location was such a small store up in Kealakekua. You know, one secretary, one sales manager, two salesmen type operation, doing maybe 5 at the most 10 cars a month. And today we have a full-size dealership in Kona, and they're doing, you know, 80 plus cars a month now. So we've had a lot of different model cars. You know, we had Volkswagens, we had Subaru, we had Hyundai, but we had to size down and decided just to keep Nissan and Chrysler.
Kama-Ina Motors started the engine of this tremendous business. Located at 400 East Kavili Street in Hilo, it holds the honor of the longest-running motor vehicle dealership in the entire state of Hawaii, and today provides employment for 160 people.
A lot of these people that are still working with the company, 30, 40, 50 years, they have a lot of knowledge. You don't want to throw that away. They have a lot of culture too, and they're important to the company. That's what the company is built on, the people. Not the buildings, the people.
The car people who care about their customers has carried itself proudly down the road of progress and into the hearts and historical remembrances of Big Island residents.
The word care goes all the way back from when I started, because Iwao Kitagawa's advertising, if you look back, it says, "I Kitagawa Company, we care." We care for you. So that care has been around for a long time.
What began with one man selling fish supplies in 1905 has developed a million times over, shaping itself through a heritage and legacy that has lasted, taking 4 generations of family members and the residents of the Big Island on the most wonderful ride of their lives.
We're going to keep on growing. We're going to keep on expanding. We're not going to go crazy over growing the business just to grow the business. We believe in controlled growth.
As Hilo and the automotive industry continue to change with the times, so too will Kitagawa, a Hilo institution that cares about its community and its many valuable employees.
You can't grow beyond your people. With the right people, you can grow tremendously, but you have to grow the people to grow the business. Most of the people who are in this business with us have a passion for the automotive business. It's a good business. Everybody needs a car. The rarity is trying to find somebody who doesn't have a car. So everybody has a car. Everybody needs to drive a car. It's part of the American freedom.